Task 2 and Task 3, we will be reading to access a non-fiction text, meaning we'll be analysing for language techniques. Remember, Task 2 and 3 are taken from the same non-fiction text. Task 2 looks at the beginning paragraphs of that text, and then Task 3 moves on to show us later or concluding paragraphs of that text. In this video, we'll focus on Task 2. You are advised to spend 15 minutes on this task, and there are 21 marks available here. Firstly, we'll read through and analyse the text for any language techniques, and then we'll look at a PTN sample answer to aid your practice of writing a structured response. Read the text below. Explain how language has been used by the writer to present his experience of an earthquake. Present evidence to support your comments. We'd had a couple of small rumbles that day. My ears detected those deepest of bass notes. Within less than a second, the vibrations had grown to a deafening loudness, and the house began roaring around me. I put my feet on the floor and braced myself as the house was violently shaken. It wasn't like riding big waves or being blown around in a high wind. It was the sharpest, most violent kind of shaking, as though the house had sat on some giant machine that was snapping it back and forth, up and down, however it liked. The shaking itself was physically painful, and the noise was incredible, deafening, like nothing I had ever heard before. It was clear to me there would be damage, and there was. Everything in the kitchen was hurled out of the cupboards and shelves onto the floor. So we can tell already here that the writer has used quite sensory, descriptive language to explain his experiences of being in this earthquake then. Now, we already know from reading the question previously that this is a piece of travel writing. It is an article, and the writer remembers the time an earthquake shook his family's home in New Zealand. So he's here with his family. He's just been in an earthquake, and it's quite sensory descriptive language. So, looking at the language then, small, a couple of small rumbles, so the use of the adjective here tells us maybe it wasn't too bad to start off with, and then the word rumbles, so we're getting a sense of what he's hearing here. So this is using his senses so that we as the reader can understand and feel what he was feeling in that moment. My ears detected those deepest of bass notes. So if you detect something like a detective, you're curious. You're picking up on little pieces of information here. So really we're at the beginning stages of the earthquake, and here the detected is a verb. The deepest of bass notes, so this is an adjective describing the level of sound and pitch, how it felt, how it sounded to us. Within less than a second, the vibrations had grown. Okay, so less than a second. So we have an opinion here. Okay, he thinks it's within less than a second, and it's also a statistic. The vibrations had grown to a deafening loudness. So the word deafening is an adjective. It's describing here the extreme level of the noise that was happening within the house during this earthquake. So we can tell that through the language he's been traumatized by the sounds and all of these feelings from the earthquake that's happening within a place, his home, that should be really safe and secure. So then the house began roaring around me. Now, this is a good example of personification being used. A house cannot literally roar at someone. It's being given human qualities. So we're getting the sense here that, again, the loudness, the deafening sound, it's assaulting his senses. The house is starting to take on a life of its own, even if it's a negative life caused by this earthquake. I put my feet on the floor and braced myself as the house was violently shaken. So with words like we and I, my as well up here, these are all pronouns. So we understand straight away that this is a personal experience. It's an anecdote, and this further tells us the details of his routine of what was happening in those moments. It's very factual information. He put his feet on the ground. He braced himself. If you brace yourself, you're preparing yourself for a terrible event to happen. You're waiting for bad news. You're expecting a car to slam into a wall, something like that. You brace yourself, you're preparing yourself. So the use of the verb here shows us that something terrible is about to happen in his experience. As the house was violently shaken. So we have the adjective here, violently shaken. So it's not just a rumble as it was at the beginning of the paragraph, it's now violent. And moving on to the second paragraph here, it wasn't like riding big waves or being blown around in a high wind. So we're getting a simile here, like riding big waves. But in this instance, he's saying it wasn't like riding big waves. It wasn't like we were going up and down and up and down. It was this constant vibrating, and it was violent. You were being shaken up. So it wasn't a pleasant experience. It wasn't as if you could comprehend what was going to come next. The wave would come up and you would go down. You were being shaken this way and that way, and you couldn't put your finger on what was going to happen next. So, or being blown around in a high wind. So he's used alliteration here in his language. So it wasn't like being blown around in a high wind. Again, more or less the same thing as the simile that's being used here. These are ideas that you would expect maybe to be able to compare a feeling of what it would be like in an earthquake, but he is saying that it is worse than that. It was the sharpest, most violent kind of shaking. So, sharpest here is an adjective, okay, and it coincides with words like violent, okay, and shaken as well. So we're getting the sensory details here to really describe for the reader what this experience was like, how it felt in that moment, so that we can immerse ourselves in that moment alongside the writer. Most violent kind of shaking. Okay, so we're getting repetition here of this word shaken and shaking. So the repetition of that feeling is key. And then we're greeted with a semicolon here. Semicolons, as you'll remember from class, they are generally so that we can get an extra piece of information or continuing on thought without having to start another sentence. So it's continuing to give us more details that are going to be key. So this next sentence we already know is going to be very important. As though the house sat on some giant machine that was snapping it back and forth. So we have another simile here. As though the house sat on some giant machine. So think of something small, like a teddy bear or something, sitting on top of a washing machine when it's in full flow. That sort of shaking motion, the loudness, the vibrations, it's going to make the teddy bear tremble. So in this case, the house sitting on top of a giant machine, like the teddy bear on the tumble dryer or on the washing machine, it's going to cause an extreme amount of motion. Okay, that was snapping it back and forth, up and down, however it liked. Okay, so snapping it back and forth. Okay, it's quite violent. Again, okay, this type of movement, up and down, however it liked. So we have a complex sentence there to describe and compare how the house was being moved and shaken about in this earthquake. The shaking itself was physically painful. Okay, again, another piece of repetition of this shaking. Okay, so this is a key description from the writer to explain how he felt and what was happening in that moment during the earthquake. It was physically painful. So he's used alliteration here to tell us his physical feelings and emotions in that moment. It was painful for him. And the noise was incredible. So incredible is an adjective, and we have repetition of the word deafening here. So his feelings of being shaken are repeated, and the sound of something being deafening, it's extremely loud. So we're getting the feelings and what he's able to hear. So that sensory details and descriptions are continued throughout the language. Like nothing I had ever heard before. It was clear to me there would be damage. And there was. Okay, so now we have a colon here. Colons are used generally either to create a list or in this instant for a dramatic pause. Okay, he's saying I thought there was going to be damage and there was. So it's a bum 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 moment for us here. We know that there's going to be damage, and he's probably going to tell us what it is next. Everything in the kitchen was hurled out of the cupboards and shelves onto the floor. So everything here, absolutely everything they own in the kitchen, was hurled out of the cupboards and shelves onto the floor. Now, the use of this word, hurled, it is a verb, but it's not just as though it had been thrown across the room or it fell out of the shelves. It was hurled, so it was thrown with force. So we can understand that this is an aggressive verb, and it's very befitting with the shaking feelings, the violent, the snapping backwards and forwards, with everything feeling physically painful and deafening. So this really suits the tone of the language here, where it's like an assault on the senses. So now we're going to look at a sample answer here to show you how to structure your answer. So once again, we're going to use P chains to make sure that we're developing our answers fully. And as you can see, I've color coded these for you. Point is in yellow, evidence in blue, explaining my answer will be in pink, and developing it slightly further will be in green. Now, just to remind ourselves, the question was to explain how language has been used by the writer to present his experience of an earthquake. So, point. Our writer uses descriptive and sensory language to describe his experience of being in an earthquake in New Zealand. So I'm telling my examiner it's descriptive, it's sensory type of language, and we're explaining his experience. And I've also read the top part of the question, so I know he's in New Zealand. One quotation from this non-fiction text states that the house began roaring around me. So there's my quotation that I have to pull apart now and explain. Through the language technique of personification, the reader sympathises with the writer's feelings of stress and anxiety in the beginning moments of the earthquake. So I've mentioned which type of technique has been used. The effect on the reader, it's making us sympathise with the writer, so he must have been going through something really awful at this moment. We can tell he would probably feel very stressed with the house roaring around him and that deafening sound that's being created. It was a rumble to begin with, and then it becomes incredibly loud. So in the beginning moments of the earthquake. So I need to develop this a wee bit further. By including the adjective roaring, the reader can imagine the extreme loud sounds within the house and how panicked the writer would have felt throughout this experience. So once again, for development, I have pulled a little bit of the quotation that I chose, roaring, to describe the experience a little bit further, and I've made sure to refer back to the question at the end of my development there. So there's one P chain, moving on to the second. As the text continues, sensory language is included to highlight the effects of the physical experience. So, statements such as shaking itself was physically painful and the noise was deafening details the terrifying experience for the writer and his family. So you can see here I have omitted part of the quotation and included ellipses just so that I don't have to fill in a longer sentence than is necessary, but it still grammatically makes sense. So this is my quotation that I've chosen then, and said that it's a terrifying experience for the family. So my explanation then, repetition of shaking, as you can see here, conveys that this was the main sensation experienced during the earthquake. The assault on the writer's senses are enhanced for the reader through the alliterative phrase, physically painful. Okay, so alliterative phrase means alliteration. So I could have said through the use of alliteration, but just to advance my language a little bit further, I've said the alliterative phrase. Physically painful, and inclusion of the adjective deafening, outlining the writer's feelings of being overwhelmed by the force of the earthquake. So here in the development, I have talked about the assault on his senses, how it's enhanced, the alliteration that's been used, the adjective that's been used, and then I've went ahead and included a semicolon, again so that I don't have to finish the sentence, but I want to get to the point that this is showing that it's an overwhelming experience caused by the earthquake for the writer. And then moving on to our third and final P chain here. Language is used to detail the writer's experiences and what is seen during the earthquake. So I'm moving on to how the details of the language show what is being seen. The text states that everything in the kitchen was hurled out. From this, the reader understands how strong the earthquake must have felt to be capable of throwing food from inside the cabinets across the room. So I've explained basically what was happening in this moment, that the food was coming out of the cabinets, but now I want to develop this a little bit further and talk about the verb hurled. So hurled is an aggressive verb conveying the violent outcomes of the earthquake, further suggesting to the reader how scary this experience must have felt for the writer and his family in New Zealand. So here you can see I'm referring back to the question always about how the language shows that this was an experience during an earthquake for the writer, and also that it was not just the writer, it was him and his family. Okay, and then how this language suggests all of this. It has been a traumatic experience for the writer.